Here on All Mixed Up at 105.5 WDHA, I'm Jim Monahan, and my guest is John Pizzarelli, who is just a remarkable guitar player and singer in his own right. And we got some sad news on Friday, John, with the passing of the great Tony Bennett. I know you had a relationship with Tony. What was it about Tony that stood out for you most?
Well, I think that he was such a New York character. He could walk the streets of New York and people could say hello to him, and he's just a regular guy, and he would go to people's gigs. He loved music. He was very supportive of the people who were playing music, and he made great records. So I mean, just always got to see him. I always run into him walking around Midtown. That's where he lived, and it was always exciting and fun, and he was so accessible. That's what made him special.
You and I are roughly the same age. And for me, growing up, there were three artists who stood out a lot. One was Nat King Cole, the other was Frank Sinatra, and the third was Tony Bennett. And of their contemporaries, there were others, like Jerry Vale or Victor Mona's, like, all right, they're okay, to a little kid. But Nat, Frank, and Tony, there was something about them. There was an aura of coolness. You'd watch Nat King Cole Trio play, and anything Sinatra did, I loved. And Tony Bennett, too. There was something about him, the way he approached a song, the way he could command an audience. It was remarkable.
Tony was great at all three that you mentioned. All were good at getting material that was singular to them. And all those early records like Because of You and Boulevard of Broken Dreams and those kinds of things really were singular to Tony. And the same thing with Nat Cole and Sinatra. And I think that the quality that Tony kept putting out, hit records over such a long period of time is what even separates him from, we had Tony for 7 decades in the business, longer than that, much longer than Nat Cole, and a decade longer or two than Sinatra. So it's a pretty impressive list of work.
And not only that, but one of the things that's, is so great about what Tony Bennett did over the course of his career was the way he was able to reinvent himself a number of different times. You think of some of the contemporary artists that he worked with. I played a track on Friday morning of Tony Bennett with Bono, that American classic, the Duets album. The artists on there, it was phenomenal. He just, again, being able to reinvent himself late in life.
Yeah, the second act is so impressive in that he had all these commercial years at Columbia, and then made his own record company for a couple of records worth, and 2 of those records were with Bill Evans, a great jazz pianist, and then all of a sudden the Art of Excellence in the early 80s, and then the whole audience changes, with the MTV and the Katie Lang and Lady Gaga, but the music was always on a very high level, and he was able to take it to generation after generation of people, and it's so amazing.
And a couple of the artists you just mentioned, like Katie Lang, they were huge fans of his. And, when the documentary did with Amy Winehouse, she was a big Tony Bennett fan, and almost, daunted by the fact of, wow, I'm going to be working with him.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. He also, and there's a beautiful moment where how supportive he was of Amy Winehouse when they were doing Body and Soul on that record of duets, and just the way he got along with everybody. That's what made it so much fun to watch and so much fun to listen to also.
John Pizzarelli is my guest this morning here on All Mixed Up at 105.5 WDHA, talking memories of the late Tony Bennett, who we lost this past week. John, there's a group of artists in the last, I don't know, maybe 10, 15, maybe even a little bit more years, coming from the rock/pop area, artists like James Taylor, Glenn Frey from the Eagles, who did a American Standards album, Mark Tremonti from Creed and Alter Bridge, who did a Sinatra record. I don't know if you've heard that, but it is remarkable how good that is. Rod Stewart has done it. Paul McCartney has done it. What do you think it is about those songs that appeals to that generation?
Well, I think, the success early on of Linda Ronstadt and Natalie Cole and Diana Krall, and all those artists made great standards records, and then all of a sudden everybody jumped on board. And I think the Rod Stewart records in particular, I know when I worked on so if I can drop the name, I worked on the Paul McCartney record, and Paul McCartney kept saying, I just was waiting for Rod to stop making a standard record, and that was the thing. And I think James Taylor, whose record won the Grammy that I worked on, was also one of those guys who was like, I always just wanted to go after these songs. And he did it in his own way, in a James Taylor kind of way. And I think there's something about growing up with those songs. You eventually want to get at them. And the really successful ones are the artists use their brains and how to create something that was singular to them. I think Paul and James, only because I worked on them, did really good jobs on theirs.
And, to go back to the late Glenn Frey for a moment, I know when he released the After Hours record, he said that it was a tribute to his parents because this was the music that he had grown up on. I think the only non-standard, if you will, that he had on that album was Caroline No by Brian Wilson, who years from now we're going to look back on, I think, and McCartney and Lennon will look back on them as part of not necessarily the Great American Songbook when you talk about Paul and John, but that pop culture idea type of thing.
Yeah, that's perfect what you just said, because I think that our generation is looking back at those 50 years after the Beatles and going, these songs are our standards, I've tried to take a lot of them and do them in a jazz forum in certain ways, and I think that's sort of the other thing. You think, well, these are the songs that we grew up with. There's Michael McDonald songs, James Taylor, Elvis Costello, Joni Mitchell, all those, and Sting. There's really great material in there. And I think people are starting to find all those things.
One of the things that I like talking about on DHA and All Mixed Up is the way genres cross and where the lines start to blur. Where are the lines between blues and country and rock and all of this other stuff? And every time the list of new artists who are being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame comes out, well, that's not rock and roll. Well, try to define rock and roll for me, and then we can have this conversation, because where does it start? Is it Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys? Because I could make an argument that those guys rocked.
Yeah, they were terrific.
They were.
And I mean, Nat Cole is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So
as well, he should be.
Yeah. So it is a very interesting list. Ray Charles too. All the different things, the ways that those guys made hit records are part of that thing.
John Pizzarelli is my guest here at 105.5 WDHA. And in addition to being a recording artist yourself, you grew up in a household with Bucky Pizzarelli, your dad, who had played with all of these artists, including artists like Sinatra and Tony Bennett and Dion. I mean, he's on Runaround Sue, right?
He's on Runaround Sue and Teenager in Love. He's on Del Shannon's Runaway, and he's on Stand By Me also. So
I literally grew up listening to your dad, not knowing it at the time. What was that like for you? Hey, that's my dad on that record.
Yeah, well, that was, it wasn't until he played one little lick on At 17 for Janis Ian, that was about when I was about 14, 15, where I could say, well, that's my father on there. It was actually on the edited cut for AM radio or wherever I was listening to it. So, and he would turn up on these records. He was even on Ray Charles, Georgia on My Mind. So every time the Masters comes on and they play Georgia, you hear Georgia, boom, and you hear the guitar, and I go, that's my father. So it was hard to explain to the kids, because I don't think anybody had the Dion records when I was 10. But it was a very interesting thing. My father liked more of the studios than the people he was with, until the Del Shannon people said, you're the last guy who's alive who's on that record, and showed a picture of Del Shannon playing his guitar in front of him. So it was a wild time. My father made all those records, and the other one that was Eeny Weeny Yellow Polka Dot Bikini.
Brian Hyland, if I remember correctly.
Very good.
I'm blanking on the name of the album very early in your career. I'm Hip, Don't Tell My Parents. Is that the name of it?
I'm Hip, Please Don't Tell My Father.
Okay, so your dad is hip, though. He's on all these amazing records.
He was on all of them. And it's just amazing what he did when he went to work from about the mid 50s through the 60s. So it's about 15 years of of just going places with a bunch of different guitars, and you never knew who you were walking in on.
We've talked about some of these contemporary artists like James Taylor and Mark Tremonti and McCartney and artists like that covering the Great American Songbook. You've gone and covered artists like the Beatles through the course of your career. You've done In Memory of Elizabeth Reed by the Allman Brothers Band, some Elvis Costello. When you go to pick a rock song, what do you look for?
I think the thing is, the dumb expression is a good song is a good song. And so when I tried, I made a record of all McCartney songs, the post-Beatle McCartney songs.
Mm-hmm.
And when I would try to put them in a style, a jazz style or a bossa nova or whatever, you can sing it and you go like, oh, this is a really good song. That's why it all works. McCartney had such a great body of work after the Beatles. You forget how great it really was. And you can make a case for some that might not make the shift, but that's the thing. If they're the Joni Mitchell material too, it's such great songs. Sometimes they're so singular to Joni Mitchell, they're hard to translate into another voice, but we got a couple of them in too. But that's the thing. It really still has to be a good song.
John Pizzarelli, thank you so much for joining me this morning here on DHA and All Mixed Up, talking music and more specifically about Tony Bennett. For DHA listeners who want to learn more about John, you can go to johnpizzarelli.com, 2 Z's, 1 R, 2 L's in Pizzarelli. John, thank you as always, and best of luck to you.
Jim, you're the best. Thanks for having me.